This is part two of chapter 9 and a fairly short wrap up of our conversation about electronic media regulation. A lot of this chapter is about really just setting the groundwork or a basic understanding of what the issues are that you will confront if you go into a career in media practice. But they're not just a lot of hard and fast rules to deal with. The main thing to remember is that a lot of the legal wrangling in this area and a lot of the legal differences in this area come from how broadcasting came to be regulated at all. As we've discussed, and we'll probably mention again, that the internet and print face no government content regulations and are not licensed in any way by any government entity. If you want to start a magazine, go out and start it. You don't have to ask the government. If you want to start a podcast on the internet, go out and start it. You don't need a license from the government. If, however, you want to start sending open signals through the airwaves, then you must have permission of the government. You must receive a license, and in keeping with that license, you must have meet certain obligations, basically the PICON requirements that we talked about last time, on the theory that the atmosphere is public property, and within the atmosphere is the electromagnetic spectrum, which is also public property. And so to use that, there has to be some trade-off. There has to be some benefit to the public for allowing private entities to use it. As it turns out, the fact that broadcasters use open signals and just use this spectrum creates a lot of legal encumbrances that are just not applicable to the internet or to closed signal productions. You have tons of closed premium content, HBO, Sirius, and other things and this is the key here, is that it requires an intentional act to tune in the satellite radio in your car, or to tune in to a live streamed program or a site on the internet. A person has to do something. And that's not saying you can't accidentally go to the wrong site on the internet or something like that, but it does require some intentional act. Whereas open content is just out there, and anybody who happens to have an appropriate receiver can come across any signal by accident. And this is the logic why there is still some government regulation of what broadcasters do as opposed to what happens in other communications mediums. Starting in the 1970s with cable television, you had a different world, and transition started at that time and have continued today and will continue into the future. But if you've heard your parents or your grandparents talk about, well, when I was a child, we only had 2 TV channels, that was because it was before cable. And when cable television came along, it started being able to import signals from distant stations into local markets. They broadcast signals were not strong enough to send it that far, but through cable technology they could. And there were all kinds of rules that came along because local television stations were certainly threatened by this new phenomenon of people don't have to watch, the town TV channel. They can watch Atlanta or Miami or Chicago or Los Angeles television. So there was a lot of stuff that went on during that period of time, and some of it's left over, but we don't go into any great detail on it other than the fact that it was the beginning of some changes that continue into this day. So the pressure started on broadcasters bringing actions to try to be more like people who didn't use the electromagnetic spectrum. And so there were decisions in the 2004 and in 2007 that relaxed a lot of the rules and kept made broadcasting a little bit less under the thumb of federal regulators. For instance, live shot technology is head and shoulders above where it was just a few years ago. Um, to do a live shot during a newscast was a big deal. I mean, it involved miles of cable and cameras and all kinds of stuff. But now it's done, pretty much using the internet, um, and can be done routinely. When you're doing a live shot, it's live, and if you ask somebody a question and they call somebody a ugly name or uh, use an expletive during a live shot, well, there was a time when having certain words go out over the air would result in these big fines from the FCC. But now the FCC seems to understand that if you're interviewing the fire chase chief and he says that's the biggest damn fire I ever saw, that you're not necessarily going to face punishment for that because you didn't foresee it. You didn't have time to do like they did in the early days of television, where everything was edited and shot in advance. So you see these kinds of deregulation coming into play. The big thing for the last couple of years, and certainly going forward, will be people moving away from satellite TV, from cable TV, and into live streaming, using Sling or Hulu or Netflix or any number of other providers that do not use the electromagnetic spectrum, and therefore the stations that are theirs that are only live streamed are not licensed, and so they don't have to meet any PICON standards. So that's why you can have ample nudity on some Playboy channel, or you can have movies being shown by Netflix that are full of profanity. Uh, if, however, as part of the streaming, there is a station that not only streams but still broadcasts and sends its signal into the airwaves as well as through the internet, then it's still going to be subject to a lot of the PICON standards. Um, for instance, some of the rules that remain are that if there's a broadcast station, radio or television, that uses its license by the government to operate on an assigned frequency and to send uh, signals out into the open airways, the government says how much of that time can be um, um, devoted to advertising. Uh, During the day, the time is fairly limited, like 8 minutes out of 60 can be commercials. And of course, if you've ever stayed up and watched a movie in the middle of the night, you know that you might have 20 minutes of commercials that can be sold during that time. Contrast that with something like Home Shopping Network or some other channel that is 100% advertising and always selling. Well, the difference is the broadcast station is using a public asset, the airwaves, and a um, home shopping network is not. So it can be 100% advertising. The FCC also requires broadcasters to provide public services and community content. A lot of times you'll see local television stations that have a morning show or something like that, where some guest comes on and talks about United Way or the Girl Scout cookie sale or the Salvation Army Christmas tree program. Well, that's fine that they do that. It's not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination, but the point is that it's a legal requirement. That they include some public service type of community content programming. Another rule is that we'll talk about again in just a second is that broadcasters must accept uh, advertising by political causes and political candidates. And the reason for that, you should be fairly intuitive, uh, is that if the ownership of a broadcast station favored one candidate, then they would like say, okay, only this candidate can have his message or her message on my TV channel, and the public would be deprived of finding out anything about the other candidates. Um, as we have seen several times and will always see, is that television stations are licensed to do good, and so for the children of the nation, the requirement to keep your license is that some of the broadcast day or some of the broadcast week has to be devoted to programming for children. This used to be taken care of by cartoons on Saturday morning, and I don't know exactly, how helpful to children it was to see Rocky and Bullwinkle or Tom and Jerry, but it was part of the requirement to keep your license is that you have to have some educational programming, especially targeted for children. Again, back to this issue of political ads and fairness, there's a requirement that broadcast stations accept ads from politicians, that they charge the open rate or the going rate. They can't supercharge one politician and give another one a discount. Everybody has to pay the same. And then they have to have equivalent air times. In other words, you can't put all of candidate A's commercials on during prime time and the candidate B that you don't like put all of her commercials on at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, a point that makes for a really good test question, and it can sometimes cause confusion, is because none of these time limits apply to newscasts. If there's a candidate for, well, I'll stick with candidate A. If candidate A is very flamboyant and is always doing outrageous things, and the news people just flock to this candidate and cover that person a lot, and then there's a more demure candidate that doesn't have many public events and doesn't say much, and when the time comes to vote and you do the math and you find out, well, the news covered this candidate for a total of an hour and 40 minutes, whereas the news covered this candidate for an hour of 12 minutes. That's not what equivalent airtime means. The news coverage does not have to do that. That's perfectly allowed because that's First Amendment protected press. The part where the airtime has to be equivalent and the charges have to be even have to do with providing access to send the messages that the candidates want sent to the message out. And again, they cannot be edited or changed by the local broadcaster. They have to be sent out as they are. Okay, so those are the kind of rules that remain in PyCon, and there are a few more. But overall, what we're looking at here is that there's a merging. That even though the difference, the basis for treating broadcasters different is that they use the open airwaves, and that people don't have to do anything intentional other than have a radio or television to receive their signals, that they have to be licensed to operate on an assigned frequency so that there's not chaos out there and overlapping signals, and that they, because they're using this public asset, they have to act in the public interest. They have to be responsible and good citizens, if you want to call it that. Whereas private print or in websites, they don't face any of these type of restrictions or considerations because they're not using the electromagnetic spectrum really, and they're not they're private enterprise and they don't have to have a license. Now, the last thing that we talk about in this category is something that flares up from time to time and is a big subject of conversation, and you may have heard the term net neutrality. The FCC declared the internet a common carrier long ago, because remember, FCC has oversight over telephones and telegraphs and radio and television, and as a common carrier, the FCC has management authority over the technology associated with the internet, but it doesn't have any management of its content, especially non-criminal content. And the notes talk about this, but we'll talk about that in another context later. But what the internet is seen as an information service. And what net neutrality means is that either the government will or the government will not act to control who may own how much of the internet bandwidth. Um, and this is a public policy debate. Neutrality has nothing really to do with it, and it has absolutely nothing to do with content or what's available on the internet. It's strictly a matter of what's the best policy for the country. Michael Goodwin, who writes in this area, says think of the internet out there as a driveway, and the driveway has several homes along the driveway. And so whoever controls the driveway can control who gets to use the driveway, how often they get to use it, how much of the driveway they get to use. And some houses could be cut off. Some houses could be easy to get to, some houses could be hard to get to. And net neutrality kind of speaks to this. And the issue is whether the government will enforce equality, meaning that they will not let the natural forces of capitalism get to the point where one or two companies controls the internet and locks out everybody else, or whether they will leave things kind of on their natural course, which would probably see that happen. That your big operators your AT&Ts, and other big companies would kind of gobble up all the available space. And this is more economics than it is law. Just that the natural forces of capitalism, a large company is going to buy up the smaller companies and gain control of the traffic and use things like slowing down and blocking the use. Under neutrality, the government would take affirmative action to keep the playing field open and to deny big companies the power that they would otherwise have to buy up all the internet and lock other providers or other companies or smaller companies or startups out. But it's another one of those pendulums in the law. In the past, every 6-10 years, the FCC, which again has 5 members, in 2015 they voted 3-2 to approve what's called the Open Internet Order, which was going to enforce neutrality. And then the Trump administration came in and one vote changed. So the Trump appointee made a difference, and the Open Internet Order was suspended. Trump was sued. He kind of won, but time has gone on. Biden is pro-neutrality as Obama was, and so if things continue as they are, then it can be expected that the federal government will act to keep companies from dominating bandwidth. Again, it has nothing to do with content. It's just how much space is going to be allocated to whom. There's a good analysis of this, and there are a couple of links in the notes that you might find helpful to understanding. Sometimes net neutrality is a really hot topic, and they even have marches and stuff. And so other times people think, what's that? And it's not that big a deal. We wrap up with the thought that broadcasting is not going to go away. Communication and communication technologies are additive. When was strictly word of mouth or writing out, that was the earlier form, and then that gave way to the printing press, and there's still plenty of printing presses, and that gave way to radio, and there's still plenty of radios, and that gave way to television, and there's still plenty of television, and that's given way to the internet. It's safe to predict that the trend in the United States is going to be toward less regulation of broadcasts. But now you know why broadcast signals are regulated, and at least a little bit about the remaining controls that are on broadcasters. Okay? Thanks.